President Jacob Zuma has just been on an African nations tour. Last month, he was the host of the BRICS summit, bringing together leaders from emerging economies led by China's President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin, among others. Analysts now say that South Africa is taking a leading role in pushing the African agenda in international forums. In July of last year, South Africa employed a formidable campaign machinery to ensure that its candidate, Dr. Vladamir Zuma, was elected the chair of the African Union Commission. So what is South Africa's role in Africa's diplomacy? Is it now actively pushing the Pan-African agenda? And what is influencing this shift in South Africa's foreign policy in Africa and beyond? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by the South Africa's High Commissioner in Kenya, His Excellency Ratubatse Supamoloi. Commissioner, welcome to the program today.
Thank you very much for inviting me to your program.
And also joining us from Johannesburg is Mr. Brooke Spector, a former U.S. diplomat and commentator on African diplomacy. Also joining us here in Nairobi is Irungu Houghton, an African policy analyst. But first, here is a look at President Jacob Zuma's African tour.
They're uneasy bedfellows, but this is not a time for arguments. Conflict has spread around West Africa's largest economy. It's a threat to stability and growth. South Africa says it wants to play a constructive role.
We believe that between Nigeria and South Africa, it's important to align and harmonize our thinking on the matters that need countries in the continent to take specific decisions. But at the core of some of the issues we raise is the issue of the security of the continent. As you know, that there's been some difficulties in a number of countries. We touched upon those issues and will certainly take the discussions further when we meet in South Africa.
Principally, it seems, through multilateral channels. The focus of this trip apparently on strengthening the African Union. With a South African at the helm, Jacob Zuma might hope to influence its approach. But the president has rifts to heal. Long-standing rivalries linger, and that still hampers efforts for the continent's highest body to form effective policy. Some analysts believe more could be done.
In the previous regime, Thabo Mbeki was very eminent in peacekeeping missions in West Africa, especially with Mali and Ivory Coast. So this would be a good way for Jacob Zuma to reinstate that peacekeeping mission in West Africa. So I think it would be a good way to keep up the mediation, because since Thabo Mbeki left office, mediation between South Africa and West Africa has really declined.
But the country's credibility has been dealt a blow by recent events in Central African Republic. The death of 13 South African soldiers, exposing it to accusations of going it alone. Though there was a stop in Algeria before this, it is perhaps Nigeria that matters most.
They are the biggest economies on the continent, and they're also significant in their political influence, certainly in their regional, at their regional base, Southern Africa, West Africa, and in the African Union. And so for that reason, I think that a lot of Africa's development is premised on the way the two countries interact with each other.
A more integrated African continent might require its biggest powers to get on. There has, for the best part of the past 2 decades, been this constantly competitive spirit between sub-Saharan Africa's two major powers. So they are rivals and they don't always agree on a whole lot. But one thing they can agree on is promoting peace and security right across this region. So if they can start to speak with one voice on some of the major issues, they're almost uniquely placed to have an impact. Guy Henderson, CCTV, Johannesburg.
Indeed, so what is South Africa's role in Africa's diplomacy? First, Commissioner Moloi. Now, South Africa's foreign policy has previously been seen as excluding Africa to some extent. It is now, though, pushing for Africa's economic agenda within the BRICS grouping. It has also put forward a candidate who won the African Union Commission's chairmanship. Is South Africa changing its strategy in regards to Africa?
Firstly, if you read the vision of the Department of International Relations of South Africa, you will note that we envisage a situation where we'll have a peaceful Africa, a prosperous continent, and where human rights and constitutionality prevails. So there is no change in terms of our policy. It has always been our policy since 1994 when there were changes in South Africa.
All right. President Jacob Zuma, though, did make some quick visits to some African countries, Kenya for President Kenyatta's inauguration, and then off to Nigeria, Chad, and Algeria. What is South Africa seeking from what it looks like to an outsider, a realignment on the continent?
I think you'll note that the visits that the president has undertaken, it's a continuation of what we have been doing since 1994. We owe the continent a lot, and our future as South Africa lies in the continent. So there is no change in policy. What we are doing is to make our own contribution towards a stable continent, towards a situation where there's development in the continent. So these visits should be understood in that context.
All right. A Brooks Spectre there in Johannesburg, though, under former President Thabo Mbeki, South Africa did sort of pursue a policy of quiet diplomacy. Now, with South Africa's foray into the CAR, Central African Republic, troops into DRC, are we seeing a shift in a new South Africa, though?
I think all foreign policies, whether it's South African or anybody else's, tries to balance a number of different objectives. I mean, on the one hand, there is the realpolitik thing of what kind of neighbors, what kind of further neighbors, what kind of interest and power relations you want. Then there's a layer of economic interest, and there is also always a layer of morality, and in this case that includes the human rights agenda. I think what you saw certainly in the last 2 or 3 years was an effort by South Africa to begin to exercise its political interest in line with its economic weight and capabilities. And you saw that, for example, with the push to get the chairmanship of the African Union Commission, a campaign that was really pushed very, very hard.
All right.
You saw that with a continuing effort on using South African troops in a number of conflict zones. The business in the Central African Republic was a little more complicated because it seemed to overlay also an economic agenda as well as the political, I don't want to use the word hegemony, but certainly the effort to expand its political impact in the region. All
right. Irungu, how is your reading of all this foray into the rest of Africa by South Africa?
Well, I think, first of all, it's refreshing to have this conversation. There's obviously, I think, been a shift in South African diplomatic strategy, so I may slightly disagree with the two previous panelists. I think there are some things that are staying the same. What we know from the South African foreign policy towards Africa is there are essentially 4 pillars. There is support for the African Union and the various organs of the African Union. There is support for SADC, and thirdly, there is support for post-conflict and reconstruction work, which most of us know in the context of conflict. And as we've seen recently in the Central African Republic or the Democratic Republic of the Congo or Sudan, this is the third major element. The fourth major element is really the work that's gone into trying to develop an African standby force to reduce the costs of the military in individual countries, but to create a more unified approach to this. And I think this has been a stable platform for the ANC as the government in power. I think what has changed really is that we've seen a very vigorous battle, which was quite bruising, to have Nkosazana Zuma appointed as the chairperson of the African Union Commission. And more recently, we've seen South Africa go out of its traditional zones of influence into West Africa and notably into Francophone West Africa. And this is new, I think. And there are a lot of reasons for this, I think, that we could discuss. I think it's important to recognize that South Africa is a big player on the continent. They have embassies in 46 out of the 54 countries across the continent.
All right.
They are responsible for 15% of the budget of the African Union, alongside 4 other nations, and collectively they produce 75% of the budget of the African Union.
All
so
right.
I think there are shifts and there are continuities in this.
Coming back to the African Union, though, Irungu, the former South African President Mbeki did put an emphasis on African renaissance, and that is what is underpinning the 50th anniversary celebrations, I think, of the African Union. Do you think, though, that South Africa is now projecting its ideals through the African Union, through Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma?
Well, again, I think there are interesting contrasts and commonalities. I mean, it is interesting that at this point in time, the main thrust of the South African government is on maintaining governments that have been threatened by rebels, and that's essentially a conflict and peace and security thrust, whereas Nkosazana Zuma has made it very clear in a number of addresses that human security must be based on development and governance, so that she's taking a much broader look. So I think this is one of the departures that suggests that there are, different ways of looking at the continent.
All right, and that to Commissioner, what are the political and economic and commercial interests here in forming South Africa's foreign policy? Are there certain countries in Africa and beyond that South Africa is seeking to enhance its political and economic relations?
I think it is obvious that wherever we get involved with certain objectives. We do pursue business interests, but let me say that wherever we have been involved, especially where there's conflict, it is at the invitation of either the region or the AU. So when we get involved there, for instance, in the CAR, after our involvement, some South Africans found some business interests there, and we do encourage our people to invest in those countries because, among other things, we need to help them develop their economies.
All right. Irungu, though, about 15 African heads of state were at the BRICS summit in Durban last month, of course. Can South Africa now be seen, though, as representing Africa globally through the BRICS grouping and through the African Union?
I think we have to be careful to distinguish between voice, visibility and vote. It is true that South Africa did host this meeting of, we're not sure how many presidents showed up, but allegedly 15 were invited at the back of the BRICS summit in Durban a month ago. And South Africa was very much seen as the convener for this. But it would be not, I think it would be a stretch to indicate that South Africa now can speak on behalf of the whole of Africa. I think that is something that can be negotiated issue by issue and moment by moment. What's true is also that South Africa does not represent the continent, can't represent the continent because it has its own domestic interests. And the African continent is as diverse as its 54 nations. All right.
Commissioner, I just want to come to you with that whole question about involvement in African conflicts. Now, South Africa did veto the NATO involvement there in Libya a while back. It has complained quite loudly about French troops in Mali. Now, the emerging pattern is South Africa seems to be digging its heels in when it comes to foreign intervention on African soil. What is South Africa's policy on that?
I think, firstly, we get from our own experience that taking up arms in any conflict should be a last resort. So we encourage negotiations and we encourage people to interact. Yes, there have been interventions by the foreign powers, especially the Western countries, in some of the conflicts in Africa. We are convinced that in most cases, they do not understand the source of the conflict. They do not understand how to resolve those problems. I think we also are objecting to the fact that there is no way in which these superpowers can just come into the continent and do as they wish without consulting the continent. For them, when things get worse, it's easy for them to take their people out of the continent and we are left with the problems. Yes, there is a lot of interference even in terms of where we have tried to broker peace and all that. You look at Cote d'Ivoire situation. You look at the CAR situation. we can't deny the fact that the Western countries do not want to see a stable Africa because they exploit some of the conflicts.
All right, Commissioner Super Molloy will return to this discussion in a moment. And Brooke Spector joining us from Johannesburg and Irungu Houghton here in Nairobi. To stay with us, gentlemen, we'll return to this discussion in a moment.
In Nigeria, there is a very mysterious band of brothers. A colorful troupe of entertainers who are actually medicine men. They have a very interesting marketing tool. They perform with dangerous animals in order to attract crowds. They are born into a tradition which has been alive for many generations. They are the Hyena Men.
Well, South Africa's experience in the Central African Republic, where 13 of its soldiers died in combat, has not dampened their spirit to deploy troops in African countries currently in conflict. This week, President Jacob Zuma announced they will be sending soldiers to the DR Congo. Rene Delcam has more from Pretoria.
As the South African National Defence Force prepares to deploy to eastern DRC as part of a UN mission to stabilize the region, M23 rebels have started engaging in a war of words on Twitter. They've warned that more South African tears would flow as a bloody war was looming in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But the spokesperson for the South African National Defence Force, General Xolani Mabanga, said the South Africans would not be intimidated by what he called the M23's psychological warfare.
So should it be that we are to die in the execution of our duties, we are ready to do that. Therefore, any scares or any threats that may be posed towards us, it doesn't mean that we are not ready to face them.
But South African defence analyst Helmut Heitmann has warned the SANDF and the United Nations not to underestimate the rebels.
I suspect we've underestimated them. The trouble is South Africa has not yet developed, shall we say, the moral courage to go to the United Nations and say, listen, you tell us what the mission is, we will decide what forces we will deploy. And deploy the appropriate force. What we are doing by and large is deploying what the UN asks for. And most UN peacekeeping operations are nothing more than a fig leaf. It's pretending to do something.
South Africa has had troops on the ground as part of United Nations mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo since 1998. It already has over a battalion of soldiers there. But it's still not saying how many South African troops will join the newly established United Nations Intervention Force in the DRC this time round. The SANDF said unlike other peacekeeping missions South African troops had been sent on, this latest DRC deployment was expected to involve fighting on the ground.
What's going to be different about this mission, it is the nature of the mission itself. It's not the ordinary or the normal Chapter 6 UN peacekeeping as the other mission has been. So this one is more heavy, if I may use those words, on combat. We are going to a combat zone.
Within that context, I think the South African contingent will probably be the best performing one. It has been in most UN operations. So I think the South African unit will do well, although it too looks as if it's going to be underarmed, under-equipped.
But the SANDF is adamant that it is ready to go to war in the DRC. As it awaits instructions from its Commander-in-Chief, President Jacob Zuma, on whether or not it will soon redeploy to the conflict-ridden Central African Republic.
We will do anything that we may be directed by the government to do. Even going back to Central African Republic, there's nothing that will stop us.
Renette Alcom, CCTV, Pretoria.
All right, we are discussing South Africa's diplomacy in Africa. Well, apart from what is termed as soft power, South Africa has taken the lead in Africa's conflict resolution. President Jacob Zuma was the face of Africa when a rebellion against former leader Muammar Gaddafi emerged in Libya. And recently he ordered deployment of troops to the Central African Republic, where rebels ousted President Francois Bozize, and plans are underway to send South African soldiers to the DR Congo, where the United Nations Security Council has allowed the formation of an intervention force to counter rebellion in the east of the country. So how prepared is South Africa for these military missions? South Africa's High Commissioner in Kenya, Ratubatsi Supamaloy, is still here with us on the program. How prepared is South Africa for these interventions?
Firstly, let me say that in 1994, when we attained our freedom, I normally say to people that we are a new democracy. We were expected from 1994 to contribute something towards peace and security in the region. You will note that we have had to get involved in Lesotho, in Burundi, and many other countries. Over the years, we have gained experience, and we are prepared for any situation where we are called upon to give help.
Irungu, let me get your understanding of this. There is some speculation across the continent over the South African troops in CAR. What more is known, though, about the presence of South African troops in the CAR? What is the reaction of the continent on this?
You know, there is an extent to which I think South Africa on this occasion found that it was not ready to meet the veracity of the rebels. There had to be, I think, a rethink. It was interesting over the last couple of days or the last 48 hours, the Deputy President and the President had conflicting statements to the nation about whether or not South Africa would return to the CAR. And I think President Zuma's position was that this would be an inevitability once there was clear guidelines from the regional Central African body and also from the African Union. I think the second point is really around what is informing this interest. And I think it is consistent within South Africa to have engaged in this process. If you go back as far as Angola, the attempts to try and create a government of national unity with the late John Savimbi. You look at Burundi with Julius Nyerere, and also in Sudan and other places. So this is consistently part of their process.
All right. Brooks, Inspector in Johannesburg, let me get your understanding on this. Do you think, though, that the CAR mission may have marked a turning point for future military interventions across the continent?
Well, it certainly was a shock to a lot of people in South Africa that there were troops there fighting. There were troops there, unfortunately, dying, and the circumstances by which they had been inserted there, at least in public, were less than clear, and that the more the explanations were given, the less clear they were. And it is true that ultimately the troops were withdrawn not only because some were killed, but because it was made fairly clear by a number of countries in the region that intervention was not on now that the government in the Central African Republic had in fact changed. What you're seeing is a larger picture, an effort to insist that South Africa represents the forces of order, peace, and successful economic growth on the continent. The problem is those interests sometimes interact with each other in unpredictable ways. As you have more and more efforts like this, it becomes more difficult to reconcile all these things.
All right. Brooke, though, is there a danger of South Africa's presence in the Central African Republic and the manner in which, of course, the country withdrew from that mission? Is there a danger of it undermining the country's prestige, the country's peace efforts and other operations in Africa?
Well, I take your question. I think what it's done is it's forced a rethink in Pretoria as to what constitutes the way it's going to intervene. It also, I suspect, has triggered a certain amount of nervousness in other capitals on the continent that we need to pay a little more attention to the way South Africa exerts its power and its influence. Both of those outcomes, although they were not anticipated, both of those outcomes may in fact actually be to the benefit of South Africa, because it's going to force the country to, in the future, do these things only or primarily through a multilateral or an international process. And I think that's going to make, that's a positive outcome from an unfortunate set of circumstances.
All right. Commissioner, has the country's prestige suffered as a result of the situation in the CAR?
Firstly, let me say that we didn't go into the CAR to go and fight. The people that were there were sent there to go and help build capacity for the defense of the CAR.
All right.
So when this conflict happened, when they were forced to get involved in fighting, so we don't feel that our prestige, we have lost any prestige and all that, because our forces were there not to fight, but to help build capacity.
All right. You're winding up comments, though, Commissioner, on the lessons that have been learnt on the continent by African countries and by South Africa as well on military interventions or in conflict situations in Africa based out of this.
I think our approach is influenced by our own experience. That where possible, peaceful means should be pursued to resolve conflict. But we also note that the continent does not have capacity, especially when it comes to peacekeeping and peacemaking. And that's why one of the commitments of on our African agenda is to ensure that our Peace and Security Council of the AU is strengthened, and all the other structures of the AU are strengthened, because the problem in the continent is capacity. And I think there are lots of countries that have got experience in peacekeeping and peacemaking, but we do not have the resources. So where we can, we will do the sacrifice as South Africa and see how we can contribute towards peace in the continent. All right.
Irungu Houghton, you have some words on this. What lessons, though, have been learned from that military intervention in the CAR for South Africa in particular and for Africa in general?
Well, I mean, at any one time on the continent, there are 10 fragile states. And therefore, the propensity for violence and conflict and unconstitutional seizures of power are real and apparent. And South Africa foreign policy, I think, has to be built around either of, maybe a couple of things. The first is decisive bilateral action, which is what we saw in the Central African Republic.
All right.
But I think every time I see the decisive bilateral action, I think what happened to the African standby force, what happened to the regional peace brigades and the military compacts that we've been developing. So I think an intervention by South African defense forces at the same time a indication that we have not yet got the peace and security architecture running at any point, and leave South Africa as the ambulance of the continent.
All right. Brooke Spector in Johannesburg, your final winding up comments.
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that what happened in the Central African Republic was a kind of a salutary lesson, that there are limits to what you can do without necessarily bringing all the other partners with you. This was happening both abroad and domestically. There was a certain degree of discomfiture in the country to the extent to which people did not understand the why, the how, or the outcomes. With regard to the external environment, there's going to be, I think, the lesson learned. Anything like this in the future is necessarily going to have a very formal umbrella that comes from an international body, whether it be regional or whether it be at the level of the United Nations.
All right.
I think the country has learned from that, and that's to the good. It is a shame that it had to learn it in the way it did.
All right, Brooke Spector joining us there from Johannesburg, a former U.S. diplomat and commentator on African diplomacy, and Irungu Houghton, former Pan-Africa director at Oxfam, and also an African policy analyst joining us here in Nairobi, and South Africa's High Commissioner in Kenya, Ratubatsi Supamoloi. Thank you very much, Commissioner, for joining us here on Talk Africa. Well, that has been Talk Africa today from Nairobi. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Bye-bye.